So if you don't know this project or this book already, This Separated Isle was the second bookwork made by a documentary filmmaker called Paul Sung. I'm sorry, Paul, if I've pronounced it wrong. I'm always asking him to help me pronounce it properly because I know that, that's important as well for him as a person. The second bookwork that he's made that's looking at sort of divisions in the United Kingdom, as well as what brings us together, but also what separates us. And his work is, sometimes the term would be socially engaged, but that's something that I find a bit problematic as a term. I think it's been misappropriated over the last few years, and there's a lot of tokenism in the arts. So I would say that it's more, his work is about, it's about class, it's about race, it's about inequality, more than equality, and it's about kind of having a dialogue with people from all walks of life and bringing that together. And because of that, although all what we see on the wall, it's all portraits, I see this exhibition really as a group portrait. It's a sort of a dialogue or a conversation between the artists, between the photographers, between the sitters, and between the audience. And the way it's all been brought together as a bookwork, I think it does it really, really well in that sort of way. So there's a democracy to this work in a lot of ways, to the exhibition and to the book. So as a photographer, I was invited by Paul to make a portrait for This Separated Isle, and he already had a couple of photographers on board at that point. The whole project was crowdfunded. I don't know if I'm telling you things that you all already know, so apologies, just to give a bit of groundwork. But what was really important for Paul, which I think is really important as a maker as well, every photographer was paid, and everyone was paid the same. And that in the arts is a good thing because it means that everyone can participate as well, because there's that sort of honest exchange. So we were all paid to be part of this project, and we were all given enough autonomy that we could pick who we wanted to photograph and how we wanted to represent them. So then every photograph becomes collaborative between the photographer and the sitter. So that's just a bit of context and spiel, and it's important for Paul as well. We've spoken about this a lot because I've worked with Paul on a few things. Class is a really important part of what he does, and in the last 2 or 3 years I've started saying in my artist statement for the first time that I'm a working class photographer, and I think it's a really important definition to have in my own work and in my own practice. And the reason for that is similar to the reason all the work you see on these walls. Rachel told me a beautiful story of a woman who was visitor of the day at street level, who was profoundly moved when she walked in the door because she felt like she was being represented on the walls in a gallery space in a way that she hadn't. I feel a bit emotional thinking about it, in a way that she hadn't before. And I think it's the same, well, it's different, but it's similar for, I want working class young girls to see that I'm working in photography and I'm somehow managing to piece together a living out of all my different hats that I wear in photography. I think it's important to say where you're from and how you got there, because even 10 years ago in the arts that might have been laughed at or frowned upon, and some might still laugh at and frown upon that, but I'm getting older so I care a bit less about those things. But I thought I would show this picture because it knocked me for six the first time I saw this photograph in street level. This is by a Polish photographer called Błażej Marczak, who I know and who now lives in Ottawa in Canada. But him and his partner, after he studied photography at Edinburgh College, he moved to Aberdeen. His partner was studying at the uni and he made a project called The Grey City, and some of you might have seen this work already. But I walked in here to teach a workshop one day and saw this, and I was like, oh my God, I think you were behind the counter. I was like, that's where I grew up and that's where I did my paper rounds. And my nana lived, hold on, I'm trying to work out, in King's Court, which is back here, and then my auntie Maureen lived in St Macar Court here, and a lot of my friends lived here. I grew up in a block of four floor flats, kind of in this area, but then we moved to a council house just up the road. But this in Aberdeen, it's iconic, the high rises, the skeisers, we would call them. And then my primary school and my nursery was just there in the youth club that my mum worked at. So to see Tilly Drone in a gallery was really strange for me, but because it's street level, it's not so strange because street level is an inclusive space. So yeah, I thought I would just show you where I grew up in the Skeisers. And I used to do paper rounds in all these high rises as well, and I used to get into trouble because I'd push all the buttons in the lift and just chuck 4 heralding posts out on every floor because it was quicker. Well, sometimes the work is me and my friends would make them out of order by trying to like jam them and stuff like that. But yeah, so this picture is important for me, although it's not part of the exhibition. I imagine if Boisé was still in Scotland, he would be part of this. So yeah, the reason I'm talking about class as well is that's what informs my practice, and it's taken me a long time to sort of articulate that, if you like. You know, I'm not from an academic background, I'm not from an art background, and often what happens is you end up apologising for your successes, or if someone says you won an award, you're like, oh God, you know, and you go a bit red. And it informs your work, but it informs why you want to make the work that you want to make. So a lot of my work is sort of staged documentary photography, or semi-staged, often working with communities and being a conduit as a photographer for those communities. So the work that was in street level a couple of years ago is called Many Trumped, and that's working with a land and a community who've been impacted by Donald Trump. And then for this exhibition, because it was lockdown, I got the commission from Paul, and I'd just recently done headshots for Paul Sung, who's the curator of this project, which was just at that bit in between the first lockdown, around about July, before we went into the second one. So, because he lives near me, so we could meet outdoors and make these portraits. And at the same time, he said, can I commission you to be part of this book? And I said, yes. And my other hobby is swimming, cold water swimming. So I was in the sea, swimming about, and then Yassine popped up out the water like a seal. And he was just like, hello. And the first thing I thought was, it's so funny how energetic Yassine is, because he swims underneath the water. He's like a long distance cold water swimmer, wearing the whole wetsuit and the hat, and, you know, takes it very seriously. And I thought, do you know, I'd love to make a portrait of Yassine anyway. I'll ask him if I can do one, but I'll ask him if he wants to be part of the book. And we're friends through Yassine's wife, Lynn. We had babies at the same time. And Yassine is Moroccan, and he's my pal. And I thought, right, okay, I'll ask Yassine if I can make a portrait of him and explain the project. And he was like, yeah, are you sure you want me? And I was like, oh, you're just like me with your imposter syndrome. So we did a portrait together after he'd done one of his sort of long distance swims, and it was a harvest moon evening. It was when the big pink moon came up. So I wanted to get him like just after he'd been swimming, because that's another thing that I felt was quite important, especially in lockdown, how we were looking after our well-being and how people were finding ways to deal with their mental health. And Yassine is like the happiest man in the world when you see him come out the water. He's like, hello! And like, something happens to you when you've been in cold water. Everyone like speaks louder and is all a bit excited and stuff. So I wanted sort of some of that energy for his portrait, but I also wanted it to look almost like a lot of my work is based on existing works of art. So I kind of thought about this almost Ramsey style painting, you know, with the stance. And it was meant to be lit with a reflector, but this is going to remind you of the opening, John. Our kids were there, and I gave them lollipops, and then they ran away with the reflector and filled it with sand. So I couldn't use the reflector, which was fine. I just had to work on the spot. And obviously I was aware that Yassine was out the water, so I had to act quickly because he had to go and get changed and get warm. And it looks so serene, but actually I'll post a picture later on Instagram. Ryan, Yassine's son's about here, like hanging on his leg, trying to climb up him. Like he's like, this is my moment. So it's like sometimes you don't see the sort of the chaos and the sort of moments that you take while you're trying to make a picture, because he looks so serene. And like Lynn, his wife, and me both agree he looks a bit like a seal in this picture. But Yassine is also a senior carer, so he worked all the way through lockdown. He works in the care home that's on the beach promenade. So if me and Lynn are swimming, Yassine often waves out the window of the care home. She looks out for him. And he grew up by the sea in Uzora in Morocco, so did a lot of water sports and worked in hospitality when he was there. So there's that sort of, I hope it's not cliched, but this separated isle, coast to coast, and the fact that we live on the coast, I thought it would be nice to make a picture of him, just sort of for those reasons. Yeah, and then also as part of this book, what we all had to do, the photographers and the sitters had to have a recorded interview, so which would be transcribed as part of the book. And Paul wrote the same questions for everyone, I believe, for that. So again, it's a sort of democratic way of giving a space for people to talk about what's important for them in the photographs. So Yassine's got his quote here, which is, during the pandemic, we really struggled at one point. We couldn't find staff. At that point, I realised how important immigrants are to the job market, because he's noticed as a carer, and in the care sector, a lot of his colleagues are from other places. Yeah, so I suppose it's a portrait of a carer, of a father, but it's of a certain aspect of his personality, which is sport and swimming, because that's what's important for Yassine, and that's the aspect of his personality that I wanted to bring across in this portrait. Yeah, and this is, I should have said as well, I live in Portobello in Edinburgh, which is near the sea. So this is the sort of coastline, this is Musselburgh here, and then looking over to East Lothian. So, yeah. So I like so many of these pictures, and it's hard to pick a favourite because I would pick a different favourite on every day. I'm suddenly drawn to Brooke, so I'll talk about Brooke, who is one of the youngest people in the exhibition, I think. Is that right? She's one of the youngest people represented in the exhibition and based in Glasgow. And I think I've been drawn to Brooke because I've met her twice. I met her at the book launch in Edinburgh, and she came along with Alicia Stack, who made her portrait. And then she was here at the opening. I think she's been back again with her family to show them the photograph. I just think it's a lovely portrait. This almost looks like a hand to me, although I know it's not. I think it's a door handle, but there's something almost sort of surreal and painterly about this picture, almost like a Matisse painting with that sort of blue sheen and the gaze. I wonder what she's thinking in that photograph. Tanatsi Gambura here, I think this is a beautiful portrait, and interestingly, she's a student at Edinburgh College of Art. I'm not her tutor, but she's in the same year group as a lot of my students. And I didn't recognise her when I met her, because this portrait, she's very regal, and it's got this, almost call it like a power stance. It's lovely, the exchange between her and Arpita. And she also requested, she wanted a young woman of colour to photograph her when Paul was working on the project. She's a poet as well as an artist, and she got a MasterCard Foundation grant to come from Zambia to the UK to study. And yeah, I thought it was nice. Paul worked really hard to try and find a good match for her portrait. And it says a lot, if you think about portraiture, camera angle and pose and things, and the next one we'll talk about this more, it makes her look very tall and powerful and strong. And the gaze, the fact that she's looking right out at you as the viewer, there's that sort of exchange in the portrait, and there's an empowerment there. And she's tiny, actually. Like when you meet her in real person, she's so articulate, amazingly articulate. And you can watch her talking about the project at an Edinburgh Book Festival talk that they had. But yeah, I quite like that sort of, who makes a photograph, I think, of a person and of a sitter, that makes a difference as well. And there's that sort of energy between the photographer and the sitter, and then us as the viewer. So it'd be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on some of these portraits as well, and what you think. But yeah, I think that one's a very memorable one as well. It's been used in a lot of the articles and things written about the exhibition, and and I think it's that really confident gaze that she's got right. Sorry, if I made you uncomfortable there, but like sort of looking directly out of the photograph. So, and think about that when you look at other portraits. You know, if someone looks away slightly, you know, there's that sort of passiveness in an image. If someone's photographed from below, there's an empowerment, and from above, often it sort of diminishes someone's status. So it's worth thinking about these sort of dynamics in photographs as well. But I'm a way to contradict myself and bring you over to a picture here. Is by a good friend of mine as well. A good friend of mine who I've never met in person, actually, but we've been friends for over a decade and often speak on Messenger and that sort of thing. And that's Jim Mortram, who is a photographer based in England, in Durham. And Jim, the photographer, I'll talk about the gaze in a minute. Jim, the photographer, the artist, is a remarkable person and a maker. And his work really comes from an empathetic place. So although the camera angle here is looking down on Simon, who's in the photograph, Simon's his friend. And if you look at Jim's work in a wider context, you know, he makes bookworks often about his friends and his neighbours. And all of his work is about austerity. And it's about austerity in the UK, in the here and now. Jim's always putting everyone else first. So his photographs are almost illustrating what's going on in the here and now, but in a really powerful way. And often with, you know, Stark, he doesn't take things away. He tries to show things as they are. And so he's got this perspective as a working class person who's gone to art school, who's come back and become carer for both his parents, and he's trying to reflect how things are on his street, in his here and now, what his neighbours are going through. So yeah, Simon, the angle of this portrait, it could, if it was another photographer, I might critique it because it's got that sort of higher camera angle which can diminish the status of the subject. But I can tell with his gaze, although even though his arms are crossed, he looks like he's just a way to make a roll up, and he's in his house. I can see the empathy between him and Jim. You know, there's an equality between both of them, even though Jim's holding the camera. He's an advocate for his friends and for his neighbours. And yeah, so please have a look in the bookshop. They're not for sale, unfortunately. Please don't take them away. But I've left a couple of books with pictures of Jim's work. But if you follow on Instagram or Twitter, Small Town Inertia, or J.A. Mortram, you can look at Jim's work and his life. And he's one of these really authentic photographers that everybody connects with on different levels, I would say. But I love him for his honesty and for his sort of collaborative way that he respectfully makes work with his neighbours. So again, he's not being parachuted in to make a project for The Guardian about poverty. He's living the same effects of austerity as everyone else. Kira Leeming is a journalist by trade. So first and foremost, she's a journalist, and for years she's worked for newspapers and for The Big Issue and all sorts of different publications like that. But Kira took up photography as a way of extending her journalism, if you like, but not necessarily photojournalism, but just because she works on long-form projects, long-form stories, and she makes articles often about people that are like portraits. So she did this project about Roma communities near where she lived and with Roma communities, and I think that was when she really started to get into photography. So it was a way of expanding her storytelling. And Owen Hazley, who Kira's photographed here, again, you see the direct gaze of this photograph. It's a head and shoulders portrait. The stance is very symmetrical. You know, he's not kind of hiding away or diminishing himself in any way. It's a confident person. You can tell that he has been photographed before. I think it's the same with Arpita's portrait there. You can tell that's someone that's comfortable in front of the camera, you know, that's used to being photographed. And Owen Hazley, has anyone heard of Owen Hazley before? No, so he is based in Manchester, where Kira is based as well. She's based in Lewisham, which is just outside Manchester. And his name came to prominence in the press and in the Parliament, not just because he's an MC and because he's a DJ. He does a lot of work like ISILT does in communities around his local area, working with kids through music and that sort of thing. But his name became known because he was almost deported to Jamaica. He was within 20 minutes of being deported to a country that he hadn't been to. He was in his 40s and he hadn't been there since he was 4 years old. And the reason they wanted to deport him was because he had been in prison for a year for domestic assault, which I'm not justifying in any sort of way, but he was treated differently from how other prisoners were treated because of his race. And he was going to get sent on this plane. I think there were 39 people. I'll have to, again, fact check that one. Maybe it says here. Yeah, but he was 20 minutes away from being deported, and his MP was in Parliament, and a petition was set up where 100,000 people signed this petition to keep him in the UK. And it was all largely due to the fact that he was Jamaican born, but he lived in the UK since I think 1977. He's got 3 children. One of the people through, I think, the Home Office said to him, well, you have to bring them up online because your children are British. So he was in this sort of place where he had to explain to his young kids that he might have to go. And his wife was distraught because she had just lost her father. She thought she was just going to lose her husband again. And Kira has written, and I've put it behind the counter as well, an article for The Big Issue about Owen, and that's how they met each other. So she thought it was important to represent him in this book. But yeah, it's interesting because there are so many portraits in this exhibition, and there are so many people, and there are so many stories, and there are so many rich, complicated lives. If we saw this could easily be an advert for this hat or for these, because photography aesthetics are used differently in the media now. But the good thing about having the book in people's names and hearing more about them is that we can look deeper at everyone's stories.